Very honored that Alice has made the journey all the way from Jerusalem to New York. It should have been the other way around. She's an elderly woman. She's a wise woman. She's an old woman. And she has earned the zchut, how you say the zchut? The merit that we should all have flown to Jerusalem instead of troubling her to come all the way here. But she's here already. She's made the journey, and we're very happy to have her. And I would like to invite my friend and colleague, Rabbi Joy Levitt, to introduce the program.
So when I had dinner with Alice in Jerusalem a couple of weeks ago, and told her how pleased the JCC was to be hosting this event, she replied in typical Alice style, well, yes, but the room there isn't big enough, I hear. So I told Alice earlier she was so right. And we are so grateful to our partners at BJ for opening this beautiful sanctuary to accommodate your many New York fans. The number of co-sponsors of this event represent the love that so many of us feel for you and your work. I want to thank NCJW, NIF, and Amenu, and of course the FOA, the Friends of Alice, for making this evening so special. I said Lilith. I didn't say Lilith? Thank you, Lilith. Thank you. Lilith. A short biography. Alice Shalvi headed the English literature departments at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and Ben Gurion University of the Negev. She was the founder of Pelach, an experimental school for religious girls, and Ohalim movement of the neighborhood associations. She was also the founding director and later chairwoman of the Israel Women's Network. In that latter position, she was one of the most prominent feminist advocates in Israel, developing a program that covers most forms of discrimination and disadvantage faced by women in Israeli society. An important aim of her work was gaining acceptance of Israeli women's contribution in all sections and in all levels of the armed forces, since army service plays such a significant role in Israeli economic, political, and social life. She founded the International Coalition for Aguna Rights and served as the rector of the Schechter Institute. Among her many awards, Alice received the Israel Prize in 2007 for lifetime achievement and special contribution to society in the State of Israel. I left out 4 pages of this biography, and even had we read it, it doesn't begin to describe the impact, Alice, that you've had on the lives of women and men throughout the world. I want to quote Galia Margolius, who said, "You invented Israeli feminism." I'm going to go with that. At a time when role models for courage and activism are so desperately needed, Alice, you are quite simply our hero. We're delighted that Alice will be in conversation this evening with another fierce leader of our community, Kathleen Peratis. Kathleen, a practicing employment lawyer, is a founding board member of J Street, founding chair of the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, and an occasional columnist for The Forward. Peratis was the second director of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, succeeding Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And of course, many of you saw Kathleen's stellar performance in RBG, and has been president of the New York Civil Liberties Union. She's a proud member of BJ. Please welcome Kathleen and Alice.
And I'm going to use your copy of the book. when I ask you to read, I'll give you my copy. So you see, we haven't really practiced very much. And if you might notice that. You might notice that Alice's book has a lot of stickies, and my book has a lot of stickies, but they're not the same stickies.
No.
So we'll see whether we can coordinate
this.
this.
Evening, Kathleen is the boss. So.
That'll be the day. So Alice, you have led, as Joy has said, a remarkable life of accomplishment. You might be getting tired of all the honors and accolades that you get every Monday and Thursday. You were an 8-year-old refugee to the United Kingdom, having come from Germany when you were 8. You excelled.
I was 7.
7, sorry. Now she has at least 12 corrections to Joy's introduction. So you just have to know that's how it's going to go tonight. You excelled as a student and became a Shakespeare scholar. In Israel, you were successful probably beyond your wildest imagination. You were the first woman this and the first woman that, and an esteemed leader of so many social movements, and you received prizes. I'm going to get into all that, but I don't want to start there. Your book is remarkable. I'm not sure how many of you have yet had a chance to read it, but Alice's story is set in the 20th century Zionist movement, the founding of Israel, the development of Israel. Her story is the 20th century story of Zionism in Israel, and yet it is extremely intimate. It's very personal. There are dozens and dozens of beautiful details. The writing is straight and plain and very affecting. I wish we had 3 hours for me to ask her questions. We don't. We have 1. So you're going to miss a lot if you only know what Alice says in this interview. You really must read the book. It's very beautiful. So I want to start with your involvement. I want to start with current events before I back up and start with you as a 7-year-old refugee. Your involvement with the Israel-Palestine conflict over the years. You made Aliyah in 1949 with a head full of dreams. You told Sandy Browarski, who is here a week or 2 ago, that you thought it was now not a dream but a nightmare. I'd like you to tell us what you meant by that, and also would you share your attempts at peacemaking. And there's a wonderful story in your book about a conference in Brussels in 1989. So could we begin with that, why it's a nightmare and how it might not have been, and the hopeful events you were involved in? Start with something small.
Yeah. Why it's a nightmare. I think the great problem with Israel at the moment is that we have lost our way. I think that having become, in 1967, an occupational power has corrupted us morally. I think it is not good, I really mean not good, for one nation to have power over another nation. Lord Acton famously said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the real nightmare at the moment for me, I'm speaking on a very personal level because this is a personal evening, the nightmare for me at the moment is that I don't see us moving forward towards peacemaking. On the other, it's going the opposite direction. Now, of course, yes, someone pointed out to me last night, it takes 2 to tango. But somebody has to lead, and I think it is incumbent upon the more powerful nation to lead. Right? You can't expect an occupied people to lead in peacemaking. So the dream is still there. I haven't given up the dream. But concurrently, I mean, the dream is still for a better future, a future of peace. We have wonderful people. We have wonderful young people. We have innumerable social action groups. I think one of the major problems is that all of these excellent groups, each dealing with a different issue, wide-ranging national issues, are not coalescing into a political force. So that the nightmare for me really is that I don't see much hope, although I'm a very optimistic person by nature. At the moment, in the present situation, I don't see much hope for change.
Well, let me take you back to times over the last 25, 50 years, but over the last 25 years when there was a feeling of more hope and it did seem like a solution was at hand. And would you tell the story of the conference in Brussels, the women's conference in Brussels,
sure,
and what happened and this?
Absolutely. What year was it?
89.
89, mm-hmm. Right. In 1989, at the initiative of a wonderful Belgian Jewish family, the Zuskins, there was a dialogue between Palestinians and not just Israelis, it was Palestinians from Palestine and from their diaspora, and it was Jewish women from Israel and our diaspora, meeting in Brussels. And it began on Friday night with Hanan Ashrawi making one of her brilliant Spitfire speeches condemning Israel, the Chinese ambassador, woman ambassador to Belgium, making a damnatory speech about Israel, attacking Israel, to the extent that I turned to my fellow religious friend from Israel and said, you know, if it weren't Shabbat, I'd pick myself up and go home now. There's nothing to talk about. And this rancorous mood continued the next day on Shabbat when we took it in turns. We alternated between Palestinians and Jews, Jewish Israelis, in speaking. And it was one attack, counterattack, another attack. It wasn't getting us anywhere. And at one point, a French Jew who had been in the resistance during World War II described her experience of the Holocaust, which we keep returning to rightly returned to as a major justification for a Jewish state, right? That it shouldn't happen again. At which point one of the Palestinians, a kindergarten inspector, turned around and said to her, don't come to us with your Holocaust, we have our own tragedies, and described how in one of the kindergartens, a group of Jewish Israeli soldiers invaded the kindergarten in pursuit of someone who'd thrown stones or done something, and beat him up in front of her little wards. It was horrifying. It was a horrifying story. It was an accusation. But the next person who spoke, a remarkable woman, a professor of archaeology at Birzeit, a very beautiful, tall, impressive woman, turned around and said to her fellow Palestinian,
do you want to read it?
Ooh. We cannot, must not dismiss the Holocaust, she said. We have to be aware of Jewish suffering, because it is through their own suffering that Jews should come to appreciate and understand ours. And that was a turning point. From that moment on, speaker after speaker, we alternated. Right?
What happened in the room when she said that?
Well, it changed the atmosphere. One felt, wow, now someone from the other side is willing to see, to take the point of view of the antagonist, of the opponent. And therefore, I think we felt it incumbent on us to follow suit, to be generous, to come forward with positive proposals for ending the conflict. It was an amazing, it was as if someone had cast a magic spell over the meeting and completely transformed the tone of it. And from that moment on, there was positive exchange. Meanwhile, Nomi Khazan and Hanan Ashrawi were running in and out of the room, so that by the end of Shabbat, the end of the conference, they came up with an 8-point proposal, which actually was a forerunner of the Oslo agreements, right? The first point in the 8 points being each side recognizes the right of the other to a sovereign state within the territory of Palestine. Right? Had those 8 points been adopted at the time, by our respective male leaders, right, we would have had a solution far earlier. For me, it was a very significant indication of the way in which women display flexibility, openness, readiness to listen to the other side, to comprehend, to feel with, literally sympathize, empathize with the other side. And the tragedy was that we couldn't finally announce this agreement because one of our delegation was a member of the Labour Party, which was then in power, and she couldn't sign off on the agreement without getting approval from the head of her government, which was Yitzhak Rabin, not yet in the peacemaking mood. And we were unable to publish it. And for me, I burst into tears when I realized with all our effort, with all our reaching an agreement, we yet couldn't publicize it and couldn't take it further. Can I go on to the dinner party?
Yes, I was going to skip it because we're absolutely going to run out of time, but it's such a good story. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. At the end of the conference, the Zuskins invited those of us who remained to dinner at their home, and I found myself sitting next to Hanan Ashrawi. And we exchanged, what do you do, where do you do? Well, it turned out we're both professors of English literature, and she teaches Chaucer, and I taught Chaucer. We both loved Chaucer, right? And then she asked me, I asked her where she studied, she told me, and then she asked me where I studied, and I said, at Cambridge. Oh, she said, so you're British. I said, well, actually not. I was born in Germany. I came to England as a refugee. A refugee, she said? Yes, a refugee. We had to flee from Germany when the Nazis came to power. And again, she repeated, refugee, and I suddenly realized that this highly educated, politically savvy woman had never conceived of an Israeli as a refugee. Right? She had this notion a refugee is what we, the Palestinians, are. And it really brought home to me, again, the need for understanding, knowing the other side, and not coming with your minds made up already in one direction or the other.
You also said in the book that it was about this time that you first met Palestinian women of your class and education.
Yes.
So that was an opening for you too.
Absolutely, yes. It was a transformative experience, I would say.
On both sides, apparently.
Yes, absolutely.
Alice has another chapter with Hanan Ashrawi that occurred a year or two later. We really can't go into it,
no.
But buy the book and you'll see
buy
it.
The book.
It's hilarious and very poignant. Okay, I would like to now go back to almost the beginning. As you said, you were born in Germany, and you were there until you were 7, not 8. Okay. Can you say a little bit about your memories of those years, stories of your parents or your grandparents?
Of my years, childhood years in Germany.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yes, I was a very precocious child. No, I really was. I somehow learned to read. By the time I was 4, I was reading fluently. And I don't, well, you know, children's books. I wasn't reading anything very sophisticated. But I was
Shakespeare yet?
Not yet. No translation, no good translation into German anyway. That I remember. I don't remember who taught me, how I was taught, how I learned it. And I remember sitting one day, gathering a group of other little girls around me and reading aloud to them from the only book I possessed, actually, which the Doll Mother, it was called. And the mother of one of the girls came in to fetch her home, and she suddenly realized that I was actually reading the book. She thought I was just making up a story. So that's one of my very strong memories. The other memories are very much of family. My grandmother lived with us. It was she who taught me the Shema. And my mother worked in the family business with my father. My grandmother was the one who put me to bed. By the age of certainly 3, I knew the Shema by heart. But I pretended that I needed her with me, and I would hold her hand till I pretend to fall asleep, and as she withdrew her hand, grabbing it back. The most vivid stories I remember is standing in the kitchen, looking out next to my father, looking out of the window onto the snow. It had snowed earlier, the previous day, and seeing red spots in the snow. And my father saying to my mother, "They got the communists." I didn't have a clue. I didn't know what it meant. It wasn't until much later, much later, many years later, that I realized that what he was referring to, that as you probably know, it was the communists who were the first group to be persecuted by the Nazis, communists, trade unionists, and so on. And there must have been a flight of someone, and they got shot. And that memory is so clear in my mind of the red spots in the snow, but inexplicable and not understanding what my father said, remains now very strong. There were other incidents, my brother coming home from school with his shirt torn and scars on his body because he'd been beaten up by some of the Hitler Youth people. The all the youth movements had as part of their uniform a shoulder strap, a leather shoulder strap. And the Jews were then forbidden to wear their shoulder straps. The Nazi youth went on wearing their shoulder straps and used them to beat people up. It was my first sense that something serious was going on, but I couldn't understand it. And then coming home one day from school, finding my toys scattered on the floor in the kitchen, where there was a cupboard in which my toys were kept, and not knowing what had happened. And within a few days, my father leaving for England. It's amazing how strong one's memories can be without knowing at the time what the thing is that you are going to remember in the future. Right? A phenomenon, a physical phenomenon, the reason for which I did not know and didn't ask. Right? I didn't realize that our house had been searched, that was why my toys were scattered on the floor. Right? I only remember now the sequence of that incident and then my father leaving. And the fact that it took him 10 months to get the British government's permission to bring his wife and 2 children and my mother's mother to England. 10 very bitter months, again, which neither my brother or I went to school. We moved to another city because I learned more recently from letters that my mother wrote to my father, which my brother found when he brought our family papers to Israel when he moved. The entire correspondence, almost daily, of my mother's letters to my father. I haven't, of course, got his to her because she wasn't going to leave Germany with a collection of letters sent her from London. But the distress, will we ever meet again? She would always close the letter in the traditional German greeting, many, many warm regards and kisses. And on one occasion, she says, "Shall I ever kiss you on the mouth again?" And just that one phrase brought home to me the agony that she really didn't know whether they would meet again. And asking, where should I go? Some people are going to France. Some people are going back to Poland. What shall I do? And I hadn't a clue. All I knew was that my beloved father was not with us, to such an extent that in one of the letters, my mother asked my father to send a photo of himself because I couldn't remember what he looked like. And I needed to see the face again. This brings me to the whole issue, if I may, Kathleen. I know it's not in your list of questions.
You're hearing some things that aren't even in the book. You remember even more than is in the book.
The way in which children experience things very experientially, so the memory is very clear, but without the explanation for the phenomenon, right? So I know that I forgot my father's feature. Why? I don't know. This I learned only later, in retrospect. And that's why I found the writing of the book so interesting, because in various places, it was only when I was recounting an incident that I fully realized its significance.
Well, that's why you're such a phenomenal analyst of literature. That's the talent you bring to it. All these experiences that you figure out what they mean. So, you went to England and you became a little English girl.
Oh. I was never English.
I know.
Never.
So when you went to England, you fell in love with English. You say that you loved King George, and your parents were a little alarmed or thought it was a little weird that you so loved King George. You also studied Bible and Talmud, and you were very steeped in your Jewish learning and Jewish life. So how was that to be a Jewish girl in England?
Well, I wasn't just a Jewish girl. I was a refugee girl, right? So that at first, when we were among the first refugees to come to England, and it was a very rare phenomenon in 1934. And so I was introduced to everybody at school as well. This is our little refugee girl, right? And I felt an outsider. I was always an outsider. I was an outsider because I was Jewish, primarily because I was Jewish, but also because I was not English. And I think at one point I do mention the fact that we were British. When you get naturalization, you get British nationalization. But English people, or people who were born in the United Kingdom, not so united anymore, but no Scots person would refer to themselves as either British or English. They're Scottish. The Welsh would say, I'm Welsh, right? I'm Irish, right? And we were British. We weren't English. And that was very significant in my continued sense of not being part of British society, of English society, of being an outsider. I continued to feel myself an outsider till the day I left for Israel.
You tell the story of a few teachers that had a big impact on you before you went to Cambridge and London School of Economics. I was going to ask you to read a passage about Mrs. G, but maybe I'll ask you to just tell the story instead.
Oh, Mrs. G was wonderful. Mrs. G was tall, and she had a great bush of white hair, and she wore little capes, little capes, and she was our maths teacher. But she was also deeply, personally involved in the Spanish Civil War. She taught Spanish in the higher classes. Whenever we did not want to have a maths lesson, and it happened unfortunately too frequently, we would begin the lesson by saying, Mrs. G, would you tell us what's happening in Spain now? And she would tell us. She would tell us about the fascist attack on democracy. She brought over a group of children, refugees from Spain, and she was passionate about it. That was what really grabbed my attention, that a woman could be so passionate about politics. That was where I really got my first taste of how passionate you can be about politics, not in your own land, not in your own country, not related to your own people, but related to another people, which, again, should bring us back to the Palestinian problem.
So she was one of your role models.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I was terrible at maths, but she really, well, obviously, I mean, if you're not prepared to study it, you'd be bad at it. Yes,
did you ever have a chance to tell her what a role model she was?
Did I
ever have a chance to tell her what a role model she was?
No, because the war broke out, and we were evacuated, and then I was evacuated with my parents. I didn't go on at the school, secondary school at which I started. But I wish I wish I could tell her, and I wish I could have told her at a later age what an important influence she was on
Yeah, it means a lot.
And I think it's also an interesting example of how a teacher, a real educator, can leave the subject that he or she is teaching and take something completely totally unrelated and make it so important to the pupils. I don't think she intended to teach us politics, but she did.
You tell some wonderful stories about other teachers and also the anti-Semitism that you experienced in England. But we're not going to have time, and you're just going to have to read the book. They're just such terrific stories. So, but before we leave England and go to Israel, there's a long passage I was going to ask you to read, but again, I think I'll ask you to tell the story of Noel and Sissinghurst. And
no, that I have to read.
Okay.
I'm sorry. This is describing an outing that
Go ahead and read, and I'll hold the microphone.
Okay.
I'll hold it, so you can hold the book.
An outing that a number of us took as soon as we graduated university, one bright, sunny Sunday in England. And we didn't know where we were going, but we happened to see a signpost to Knowle. Now, Knowle, in the typical British spelling, is spelled K-N-O-L-E, right? Go Knowle, go Knowle. And we went to visit it because it's the house that belonged to the Sackville-West family, of whom Vita Sackville-West, who was Virginia Woolf's lover, was actually the rightful heir, but couldn't inherit it because she was a woman. So she was excluded. And Virginia Woolf's Orlando is really the story of the Sackville-West family. And so my brother and I wanted to go there. Knowle is a calendar house, 365 rooms, 52 staircases, 12 entrances, 7 courtyards. It is surrounded by 1,000 acres of woodland land and part of it a deer park. At its heart lies the original oldest part of the structure, built in the middle of the 15th century, around which successive generations added layer upon layer of accommodation. The long gallery is lined with portraits of these Sackvilles. Here is, as Virginia Woolf saw, a history of England that covers 4 centuries and more. We came out to the park, sated, 5 young Jews, 3 of us not born in England, the others children or grandchildren of immigrants from Europe. For the first time in my life, I felt intense envy. Who is wealthy? Asked our ethical fathers, rhetorically, replying, he who is happy with his lot. It wasn't true, or at least at that moment it appeared not to be true. What we had seen was true wealth, the wealth not only of property, but of continuity, of knowing not only the names of one's great-grandparents and their forebears, but knowing what they looked like, what they wore, what corridors they traversed, where they mounted their horses, danced to the sounds of the timbrel, made love, being able to visit their graves, pray in the pews in which they prayed. And us? My father had his father's Kiddush cup. My mother lit her Shabbat candles in the candlesticks her mother had brought from Galicia. We had no photographs of the shtetls in which my parents were born. We were fugitives, constantly uprooted, forever on the move. Willie and I even had a mother tongue that was not the same as that of our parents. Indeed, what was their mother tongue? Yiddish, which their non-Jewish neighbors born in the same country neither spoke nor understood. Polish, to which they resorted when they didn't want us to understand what they were saying, the language of pas devant les enfants. Certainly it wasn't English, which rapidly became my mother tongue after we left Germany, while Willie continued to count in German, to find pleasure in classic and contemporary German literature. Yet he never was and would never describe himself as German. In Germany, we were Ostjuden. From after the Second World War, when we finally attained British citizenship, we were always British, never specifically English. I mystified the guard at the border between Switzerland and Italy when I presented my passport, and no wonder, it was Polish. Oh, for the serenity, continuity, and stability of the Sackvilles and of Knoll. And then we go on to Sissinghurst, which was another home of the Knoll family, to which Vita Sackville-West and her husband then moved and created the most wonderful garden. And I end by saying that here was something I could cope with emotionally, though never emulate. A little garden of my own, even a small backyard, a balcony, somewhere where I could tend a few potted plants and where I could be happy with my lot.
So that, I think, expresses one of the core ideas of your story and why you chose the title, Never a Native. Can you explain how that feeling led to sort of the idea of your book?
Led to what?
How that feeling that you got, having that continuity that you didn't have, how that expresses the Never a Native idea of your book.
Yes, well, I was never a native. I mean, when we were in Germany, I wasn't German. When I was in England, I wasn't English, it was clear. As I've said, we were British eventually for a very short time because I left Britain 3 years later after getting British nationality and moved to Israel. And the interesting thing is that even in Israel, of course, I'm not a native. I wasn't born there. I'm an immigrant. And what's more, I haven't fully integrated culturally into Israel and Hebrew. English remains the language in which I think. I dream in both English and Hebrew, I've discovered. But my thinking is essentially in English. I taught English literature for 40 years at the Hebrew University. My frame of reference is English literature and very specifically Shakespeare. In other words, when I think of an appropriate, when an appropriate quotation springs to my mind, it's not necessarily, it's almost certainly not from either the Bible, except as I say, ethics or the fathers. Every now and again a saying, yes, but essentially English is my language and my culture. And I think that actually what I realize now is that in Israel, there is a clear dividing line between those who lived there before 48 and those who came after 48, right? It's as if, like being with the Mayflower, you know, my family coming with the Mayflower. If you were there before 48, you had a completely different experience, right, under the British mandate. And you were there for the War of Independence, which was the major revolution, nationally speaking, right? And I wasn't there for that. And to that extent, anybody who came afterwards, whether they were what we now call Holocaust survivors, whether they were people who immigrated of their own free will out of a Zionist idealism, we aren't the real thing. okay? And in my case, as I say, because my cultural context is definitely that of England, Englishness, I feel it very much. And yet I know the chapter in which I describe my Aliyah is called Homecoming. Because for me, coming to Eretz Yisrael, okay, was coming home. I'd been a Zionist from a very, very early age. My father was an ardent Zionist, and my mother was an ardent Zionist. The blue and white Keren Kayemet, JNF, Jewish National Fund box was always, you know, in our hallway, and every Friday I would put a penny in. And I knew, and this is what is interesting, I knew from a very early age that I would go to Eretz Yisrael. And I was extraordinarily influenced by 3 of my cousins who were all on Hachshara, the preparatory farms where people trained for Aliyah to get a proper profession, something that would be useful like carpentry or building. And I admired them enormously. And I remember very distinctly, I was a very lonely child, actually. My brother was 5 years older than me, wouldn't deign to play with me, of course. But I remember distinctly dancing a horror around the kitchen table, myself, my arms spread out, singing, Anu olim al salif, not to the hibba, not ba. We are going up to the land to build and be built in it. Right? So it was absolutely clear to me that one day I would end up in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. Right? And yet, when I came there, right, it was a different experience. I was different. Right? So I am an Israeli. I'm fully integrated into Israeli politics, social life, right? Kathleen, in introducing me, said, you know, I've been very involved politically and social politically, right? And yet, when it comes down, you know, to brass tacks, I never served in the army, a very critical part of being Israeli. Right? If you haven't served in the army, it's also as if you hadn't undergone the real initiation rites of being an Israeli. Right? I don't speak the army slang. I don't speak slang at all. I mean, I'm very bad. My children always say you're 10 years behind with slang. One doesn't say that anymore. Right?
As soon as one of us uses a phrase, the kids know it's now over.
Yeah. So, yes, so I'm never a native, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel at home. You can, the Jewish experience, after all, is very much one of wandering from country to country and nevertheless being able to make your home in each country and being simultaneously in the country, of the country, and you're not totally of the country.
You know, Alice, in all the years I've known you...
At one point, someone reminded me yesterday that at one point I thought of calling it Always an Alien, which is nicely alliterative, and then I changed it to Never a Native, which I think is... because I don't feel... I'm not an alien in Israel, right? I'm just not a native.
Is this feeling something that you've been thinking about more lately than you've thought over the years? Because it's not something I heard from you before you started writing the book.
Well, look, when you start writing your memoirs or autobiography, it's not really quite an autobiography. I think of it more as memoirs because it's sort of snatches which cover the period of my life. You begin to think more deeply, you begin to analyze, I think, I mean, I've never undergone psychoanalysis, but I think it must be a bit like psychoanalysis. You bring up into consciousness things that were not, may even have been consciously, very consciously repressed, determinedly repressed, right? And suddenly, the memories become more comprehensible. And you begin to see a pattern, right? A pattern in your life, which while you're living it, you obviously don't see. Henry James had a wonderful story called The Pattern in the Carpet, that you have to look very closely at a carpet sometimes to see, oh, yes, there's a pattern. It's not just sporadic spots of color, right? There is a pattern here. And I think that the minute you begin to think, to examine in a more profound manner the incidents in your life, you see a pattern. And the pattern, interestingly enough, that repeats itself is that whenever I did something which became significant, whether it was setting up the English department of what later became Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, whether it was heading, I didn't found, by the way, the Palace School, I inherited it by chance, as is described in the memoir. It was imposed upon me, I would say. Pelach, which I really transformed into the first experimental high school for religious girls, and one of only 3 officially recognized experimental schools, the other 2 being headed respectively by my son and his wife. So the 3 experimental schools in Jerusalem were all headed by Shalvis. And the 3rd was the Israel Women's Network. And if I got the Israel Prize, it was for those, primarily for those 3 achievements, right? And yet in every case, I was forced out. In Beersheba, I had the audacity to apply for the deanship. And in order to present my case, I had to see all the men who were in the top positions, both in Beersheba and at the Hebrew University, which was under whose auspices the Beersheba faculty was being created. And I had to present myself and say, I'd like to submit my candidacy for the deanship. And in every case, both with Beersheba dignitaries and at the Hebrew University, the first sentence that came out of the mouths of every one of the men was, "But you're a woman." Right? Okay?
That came as a big surprise.
Well, I'd never been disqualified. We had a wonderful head of department in the English department who never discriminated in any way between the women and the men teachers. He encouraged all of us equally. He was a wonderful, wonderful person. And well, why should that disqualify me? And I started talking to my fellow women faculty members at the Hebrew University and discovered that virtually without exception, every single one of them had suffered from some form of discrimination or some kind of sexual hinting, you want a better grade, you want a promotion, okay? And I was shocked, first of all, and then as we exchanged these views, right, we realized we had to deal with it. And the whole feminist movement in Israel began in academia, actually, right? And then we founded, in '84, founded the Israel Women's Network, and I went all over the country lecturing and finding that the women were unaware, totally unaware of the inequality. But then came the infighting and so on. So I left the University of the Negev altogether, stayed with the Hebrew University alone until I took retirement. But that was the awakening. But you're a woman. And then with Pelach, my problem was that I started, through my feminist activity, opposing the chief rabbinate's stand on divorce. I would be on the radio.
Let me interrupt you for a second, Alice.
Yes.
You said you were, a friend of mine said Alice was fired from all of her great jobs, which is her great badge of honor, which is true. About Pelach, you said you were insufficiently acquainted with the niceties of Orthodox Judaism as those find outward expression, and that's what got you in trouble at Pelach.
Absolutely.
Say a little more about what you mean by that.
Well, for example, I hired a woman teacher of Talmud. I'd never met her. She was an American woman, a young woman who just completed her studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was considered totally unacceptable in Orthodox circles. And that was revolution, one thing. Then I invited someone from Manpower, it is Manpower, in the Israel Defense Forces to come to the school to talk about the possibilities of Orthodox girls serving in the military, because it hadn't been the practice for Pelach pupils until then, and that brought about a significant change. And finally, I had met with Palestinians, and all three of those things.
That was the last straw.
That was the last straw. Yeah. So that led to my resignation.
But you say in your book, and people know, and it's a truth, that even though Pelach forced you out, or I guess it was the Ministry of Education that forced, Ministry of Religious Education, Alice says this in the book, and it's snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. I'd like to read just one sentence. Surveying how feminism has affected Israeli society, one is compelled to admit that the greatest revolution has occurred in modern orthodoxy. Not only have the women themselves come a long way, they've carried their communities in their wake. Echoing the psalmist, I say, I sowed in tears, but I'm reaping in joy. So say a little about what your experience at Pelach meant for religious women and women in Israel.
Well, what it meant for religious women was that it gradually legitimized women's Talmud study, that my pupils have become teachers, that three of them have been ordained, that they set up, together with a wonderful woman, Hannah Kahat, who was not a Pelach graduate, a new organization, Kolech, Your Voice, which was influenced by JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist was the association, I suppose, in the States. And they have transformed modern Orthodoxy. More and more, modern Orthodox prayer groups, not synagogues, are doing things differently, with various degrees of egalitarianism, right? And I say 3 of my girls have been ordained because it's now possible, very not easy, but it's possible for women to be ordained as rabbis, even in Israel. It's not recognized by the official rabbinate, just as weddings not carried out by authorized rabbis, authorized by the chief rabbinate, are not considered legal. But it's happening. That's, to my mind, interesting enough, where the major feminist revolution is taking place. within modern Orthodox Judaism. Because, in a way, the further back you are, the further we progress ultimately, the more powerful the progress becomes when there is a revolution. It's not a revolution, it's an evolution. And every time I see another step, the women being allowed to, the women taking the right to perform in ritual things which were simply unacceptable. And it comes from power. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. If you're ignorant, you can make a lot of noise, but you can't really put your case cogently. Once you know what you're talking about and can argue on level with your opponent, as the women now can, that's when you really make progress.
A big fuss was made. I shouldn't say a big fuss, I don't mean to trivialize it, but it was important when it seemed as if you sort of said you were no longer Orthodox. And you said in an interview that to Haaretz a month or so ago that you don't know if you were ever Orthodox in the true sense of the word. So can you say something about whether you left Orthodoxy, whether Orthodoxy left you, and where you are now as far as religious practice?
I left Orthodoxy because Orthodoxy excluded me. I was excluded anyway. I had no status within Orthodoxy. I couldn't be part of a minyan. I couldn't be a rabbi in many respects, in many places in which I spoke, in Orthodox synagogues. When I was touring the United States, the rabbi would say, before I was called to speak at the end of a service, would the gentlemen please fold their talitot so that there's no danger of my talking being considered, possibly being considered as part of the service. Right?
But that was the case for decades. When you finally couldn't take it anymore, what brought you to that point?
Anger, extreme frustration, and a sense that really my very strong sense of equality of all people, equality of the sexes certainly, and within Orthodoxy at that time I couldn't find my home. And even now, though I very much admire what is happening with women in modern Orthodoxy, and each step forward is admirable, it still isn't enough for me. I want total equality. I want to be counted in the minyan. I want to be able to lead a service. Right? I want to have a woman rabbi. Right? And all that is...
So let me now get even more personal. You have 6 children, and you say in the book that you were a failure as a mother. And you say it very starkly, and you say it more than once. You also talk about difficult body image feelings that you had and grew up with. And you reveal that you had an abortion. Raw, personal stuff. How did you decide that you were prepared to say all those things to a large audience? And talk a little bit more about motherhood, because people argue with you when you say that.
Look, I think if you're writing a memoir, you have to be frank. The question is, do you have to tell the whole truth? Okay. And I felt that the two incidents which have most shocked people who knew me but didn't know about them, one was being raped, and one was the abortion. And I had the abortion for medical reasons, but it was at a time when abortion is still illegal on many grounds. Abortion is legal in Israel on only 5 grounds. Otherwise, it's illegal. No one's ever actually been prosecuted for it, but officially it's illegal. And I had it because my doctor felt that the baby was in danger of being born abnormal. And I feel very guilty about it. I feel guilty about the abortion. I don't
describe the abortion issue being before the Namir Commission.
Look, I think, I don't know, I can know there was a time when in the feminist movement here, all the leading feminists came out as saying they'd had, whether they had or not, I don't know whether they were speaking the truth or whether it was just, you know, to make a point. And I cannot accept abortion just because you don't want a child. If you can't have a child because you can't afford it, really can't afford it, it means bringing another child into poverty. And even then, if you have the child, it can be adopted. There are ways of getting around not having an abortion. And I feel guilty at having deprived a human being of the potential of being a full human being. About the rape, I felt it was essential to tell the story. And way before the hashtag Me Too, I wrote that passage a long time ago, and it happened a long time ago. It happened before I was married. But I felt that incident completely colored my entire attitude to sexual relations. I don't think I've made that clear enough in the book, and I think I should clarify it more.
Clarify it now.
Because it made me think of sexual relations as something indulged in for the man's pleasure, with no consideration whatsoever of what was involved for the woman. Pleasure, lust, right? And I think for a long time, for many, many years, even after I was married, having sex was somehow associated with that one episode. And it took many years to get over it. And I think that perhaps we don't sufficiently understand now with the whole Me Too thing coming out, we realize how deeply a woman can be affected by a rape without being conscious of the impact it's had on her. And only because things can now legitimately be spoken about do women recognize their own response and their feeling at the time, because it must have been something that they have obviously repressed for years, right, in many cases. And all of a sudden you're given legitimacy. And in my case, that, as I say, in retrospect, I think that it colored my sense of the woman as the toy, the victim, the plaything of the man.
But you turned it into activism and change and revolution.
Not that incident.
You don't think that affected all of your women's rights work for the next 50 years?
No.
This happened shortly after you moved to Israel, didn't it?
Yes, it happened within 6 months of my reaching Israel. It was my landlord who did it, who was also a friend. And that was the shock. That was the real shock, you know, that what is rape? It was a long time before I recognized it as rape, right? To take something, to take somebody by force against her will. And I think in describing it, it wasn't even against my will. I was hypnotized in a way. And it took me many years to analyze precisely what happened there. Precisely. And I still don't know. It's totally repressed, clearly. And I'm not interested in psychoanalysis. I don't want to be analyzed over it. But I do know that it affected me strongly. The betrayal of it.
Well, you know, you have a lot of company in any group of women you're with. It's really a common theme that such a large proportion of women undergo all kinds of sexual harassment, including rape, which accounts for the movement. I would like to think that even though you don't think it had a big impact on your life's work, I think, again, you turned mourning into dancing. I think you can all see why this is one of the great national treasures of womankind and Judaism. I would love to go on longer with more, asking Alice more questions. I have 27 pages of them. But I'd like to give you all a chance to ask questions for maybe 10 minutes, if that sounds okay.
Thrilled that Rachel Dopkin got convinced on our trip last March that you needed to come to the United States after you kicked off our amazing feminist conference. I feel a little frustrated, Kathleen, because you started down the path of the Israel women's movement that Alice largely was the mother of. So I'd love you to talk a little bit, just for a couple of minutes, about the Israel Women's Network, about why now Israeli feminists don't think they have a movement. We're trying to create it so we can recreate what you began. But really just that period of time, because I don't think we gave it justice, of when you started the Israel Women's Network and kind of what happened and the sort of how it rose and then how it kind of dissipated a little bit as we try to revive it.
How it passed. Complacency. I'm talking about Israel now. You know, that all of a sudden we have, we have 2 women ministers in powerful positions, justice and culture, respectively. We have more women members of Knesset. We now have 31 women of Knesset, you know, unheard of, unprecedented. And you don't look at who they are, right? It's as if numbers count, not quality. And when you realize that our Minister of Culture is probably one of the least cultured persons in the country, right? And our Minister of Justice is doing her best to destroy our legal system, right? You realize it's just having a woman isn't enough. You need the right woman, right? Okay, just as you need the right man. There is this, as I say, this sense of complacency. We don't need a women's movement, which is where we began. I remember when Betty Friedan first visited Israel, and she met with a group of us. We were all from academia, and she propounded her theory, you know, about the frustrated housewife with a university degree. And we just said it doesn't apply to us. You know, we're all married, we all have children, we all have a profession. It doesn't apply. It took a long time to realize that we were totally deluded. We were being excluded. Yes, we were teaching at the university, but when you count and still count the number of full professors who are women, it's a marginal number, right? So the movement died out because too many women thought there was no longer a need for it. And so you need really to start the whole consciousness raising process again. Right? It's not something, it's as with the peace process. Right? It's not something which stays alive by itself. You have to keep putting in the fuel, right? And the fuel is consciousness, awareness. Right? And it's too easy to become complacent, particularly when you have so many other problems to think about. Right? And not too many people don't realize that inequality between the sexes means a social disruption. Right? Okay. But it's complicated. It's complicated because until we change, we in the world, in all but the most advanced Scandinavian countries, right, fail to recognize motherhood as a profession. Right? Motherhood, parenting, I would say, is a full-time job, and you should get some kind of reward for it. You should get a vacation once a year, right? Everything, it is something which is, what shall I call it? The whole process needs, the whole family structure needs rethinking, totally. Right? And until feminists, men and women feminists, and what's good is there are more and more male feminists, this is a real achievement.
Well, you were married to one.
And how? Yes. I was privileged, right? And he was the one before, I mean, he was a feminist even before we married.
In your connection with groups of women, and not only women in Israel, have you ever had any opportunities to talk to Orthodox women in the settlements?
Yes. There are two kinds of settlers. There are the ideological settlers, who I think are the minority, and there are the settlers who are living in the occupied territories because it's so much cheaper. Right? If you build a house in the occupied territories, you get the land free, you get tremendous financial help in the building, you get all the essential structure that you need, right? You get roads, which the Palestinian villages don't have, right? And you can live a very good life in the settlements, beyond the Green Line, let's put it, right? So there are two types, and the second type that are there because, well, at last I can have a home of my own, you know, far outnumbers the numbers who are there for ideological reasons. And I'm pretty sure that if the same terms could be offered them within the Green Line, they wouldn't go beyond the Green Line, right? Okay? But then there are the ideological settlers, okay? It's the whole land is the promised land, it's the land of the Bible and so on. But they're a minority. Right? And I don't see why, if you can reach a two-state solution, they shouldn't stay. All right, so there'll be a little Jewish village in Palestine, just as we have Arab villages in Israel. Right? So I haven't really connected with the ideological settlers. I've connected with the non-ideological settlers far more.
You can all see why Alice has been such a visionary, such a revolutionary, such a troublemaker, and such a national treasure all at the same time. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.